start the second recording. So thank you very much, Jan. Over to you to speak on Erasmus and the Greek text of Revelation.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the occasion to see so many text critical friends from all over the world. It's incredible, actually. Well, most of the text, the Textus Receptus of Revelation, goes back in a direct line to Erasmus' first edition of 1516. Some readings were changed, either by Erasmus himself in later editions or by later editors, but the textual core remained the same. The preparation of the Greek 1516 text was a complicated task, since the only manuscript Erasmus had at his disposal in Basel was a minuscule commentary manuscript borrowed from Johannes Reuchlin, nowadays known as minuscule 2814. The establishment of this 1516 text comprised of 3 steps. First, Erasmus had an assistant extract the text of Revelation from the manuscript. Second, he corrected this new intermediate manuscript. Third, the new manuscript was used by the typesetters to print the text. All these steps were error-prone, and indeed they left their marks on the result. In copying, it was not always easy to separate text from commentary, or to deal with the many abbreviations found in the manuscript. Moreover, the manuscript itself was not without errors. In some places, for instance, text and commentary were not correctly distinguished. Second, in editing, Erasmus had to decide on text critical problems, but he did not possess sufficient information. His additional sources were mainly the Latin Vulgate, as he knew it, further readings mentioned in Valla's annotations, and perhaps a few readings known from other sources, or from earlier consultation of a Greek manuscript. Many Erasmian interventions took the form of retranslation from the Latin, not only in the well-known case of Revelations 22:16-21, where minuscule 2814 is defective, but at many other places as well. And third, in printing, the typesetters made some errors that were not always detected in time. As a result, the Greek text of Revelation in the 1516 edition diverges from the majority text, which itself in Revelation is often split, at a great many places, and even from the Andreas text. Also because minuscule 2814 itself has its share of readings in which it stands alone or only in the company of a few other manuscripts. It contains even many completely unattested readings. The Textus Receptus of Revelation is derived from this strangely mixed 1516 text, which combines particular readings of minuscule 2814, errors made in its transcription, Erasmian interventions, including retranslations, and printing errors. Erasmus editions were widely accepted and used. In the case of Revelation, later editors, such as Stephanus and Beza, could not be aware of the shaky foundation of its Erasmian text. They had no good overview of the stock of existing readings and naively but understandably assumed that Erasmus would have followed a good manuscript throughout. After all, Erasmus only hinted at the defects of the manuscript and his interventions at the final verses of the book, and then only in his first edition, since for the second edition he mistakenly considered the problem to have been resolved. Annotations on Revelation are few, and text critical ones even more so. Only gradually did the specific nature of this text become known in the history of scholarship, partly because minuscule 2814 was lost for a long time, while Wettstein and Bengo in the 1730s suspected the true cause of many of the unattested readings. Delitzsch and Trigalis in the 1860s could demonstrate the process in much more detail once minuscule 2814 had resurfaced and had been identified as the manuscript used by Erasmus. Their studies have now been corrected, complemented and virtually completed by Andrew Brown. I have the book here, who published in 2013 the Erasmian text of Revelation with extensive notes on each reading. Especially Brown's work should henceforth be compulsory reading for anyone who wishes to contribute anything on the subject, even though, of course, some points of Brown's presentation and interpretation of the data can be debated. The following 10 facts are known, or should be known, about the 1516 Greek text. Erasmus used a single Greek manuscript for producing it, borrowed from Reuchlin. He did not have another Greek manuscript at his disposal during the production stage. The manuscript was a commentary manuscript with biblical text and commentary interwoven. An assistant produced an intermediate manuscript with the biblical text excerpted from the commentary. This intermediate manuscript is now lost. Erasmus edited it before it was sent to the typesetters. He hardly consulted the original manuscript. Waller's annotations provided some readings, but more substantial readings are Erasmus' retranslations from the Vulgate. And finally, the manuscript is nowadays known as Minuscule 2814. Well, how do we know all this? Well, we go to the sources, of course, ad fontes. Primary sources for studying the 1516 Erasmian text of Revelation are, it's very logical, the following: the text of the 1516 edition itself, and Erasmus' annotations, and, very important, scattered remarks made by Erasmus in letters and apologies. And for, of course, very important, Minuscule 2814 itself. And additional sources are the Vulgate text and Waller's annotations. And there are indeed a number of explicit statements by Erasmus himself, which we could call the external evidence. And there are comparisons that can be made between the 1516 Greek text and Minuscule 2814 and other information. And then you see the exact nature of the Erasmian interventions. And that can be seen as the internal evidence. But I will focus mainly on the external evidence. In 1520, Erasmus wrote against Lee, one of his critics, at the end of Revelation, in the only copy that we then had, for the book is rarely found in Greek. Well, and here you see the reference in the Latin tum, called tum nobis erat unicum, is to the time of production of the 1516 edition, and to Revelation, not the final verses, but the entire book. In 1521, he wrote against another critic, Stunica. In Revelation, we had only a single manuscript at our disposal, but a very old one, supplied by the exceptional hero of letters, Johannes Reuchlin. Again, the reference is to 1514, 1516, and it contains the important clue that the manuscript came from Reuchlin. In 1520, in a later apology against Lee, he wrote, because the book of the Apocalypse never found much favor with the Greeks, it is rare among them. Hence, since I did not want anything to be missing from our edition, I extracted with some difficulty a very old codex containing commentaries on this work from the famous scholar Johann Reuchlin. The codex, not the commentaries, of course. From it, I have the words of the text copied out. Well, here he states the provenance, the fact that it was a commentary manuscript, and that what he had done to separate text and commentary. It must have been necessary to do so, for typesetters would not have been able to work with such a manuscript itself. Brown thinks that Erasmus had the copy made because he had promised to Reuchlin that he would return the manuscript untouched, but I do not think Erasmus would have had such scruples. We know from his letters that he indeed asked Reuchlin for a New Testament manuscript. At the time, the precise plans for the 1516 edition were being made around September 1514. The request itself is not specific, and Erasmus also received Minuscule 1 from Reuchlin. And in June 1516, Reuchlin mentioned that a manuscript had been returned to him, which must refer to Minuscule 1, because 2814 was never returned to Reuchlin. Against both Lee and Stunica, Erasmus, as we see, calls the manuscript very old. Well, such remarks must be seen as almost standard propaganda, and it is typical that they occur in apologies. And I have another example for you. In the 1527 edition, he says, "Let no one condemn our copy," so the manuscript that the manuscript that we use, "for it was of such great age that it might be thought to have been written in the time of the apostles." Well, Bengal in 1734 was the first to point out, without even having seen the manuscript, that this is simply impossible for a commentary manuscript. Well, the fact of Erasmian retranslation can also be demonstrated from Erasmus' own words. He writes at the end of his final 1516 annotation, "At the end of this book, I found some words in our Latin versions which were lacking in the Greek copies, but we added them from the Latin ones." He does not indicate, and that's important, the exact scope of his retranslation, for that is the only meaning that adding to the Greek from the Latin can have. And he downplays the issue by speaking about just some words. He also uses the plural Greek copies, but he can, of course, only refer to 2814. If he had had another Greek manuscript, there would have been no problem to begin with. Such imprecisions occur elsewhere as well, and they need not surprise us. Erasmus had no great interest in explaining what he had done to the Greek text of Revelation. As one of his critics was quick to point out, if he could correct the Greek text after the Latin, on what basis could he still be critical of the Vulgate? Why not correct the Greek in many more places? And he could have even gone further. Why did Erasmus have to have recourse to the Greek at all? Erasmus must have felt very well that the retranslations in Revelation would make his entire New Testament project vulnerable, if widely known. And this one sentence in the 1516 edition on some words is indeed the only place in his annotation where Erasmus mentions retranslation. And it might even be asked why he included it in the first place. It seems it functions as the starting point of his general remarks on the book of Revelation. The rest of the annotation, the final one, on the entire New Testament, discusses style, authorship, and canonicity of the book. And we already saw a glimpse of this in the remarks against Lee. Erasmus notes that the book was disputed in the Greek tradition. He himself does not believe the book was written by the evangelist and relegates it to his second canonical rank, not only here, but in numerous writings from 1516 till his death. This one admission of retranslation, however, provoked criticism from his critics Lee and Stunica. In his answers to them, some details become clearer, but some others become more confused. And it can even be said that Erasmus, possibly being led astray by his own memory, stands at the beginning of a long history of confusion on the issue. And only Bengel and Wettstein in the 1730s started to suspect what had really happened. And even they, without having recourse to the manuscript, could not really gauge the general pattern. For this reason, only Erasmus' treatment of the final verses has acquired a standard handbook anecdotal status, and not his dealings with the book as a whole. Okay. There are some more places where he mentions retranslation, so here we go. Already in his first apology against Lee, he wrote, "At the end of the Apocalypse, the manuscript I used, I had only one, you've seen that, was lacking one or two lines, verses. I added them following the Latin codices. They were of the kind that could be restored out of the preceding text. Thus, when I sent the revised copy to Basel, I wrote to my friends to restore the place out of the Eldine edition, for I had not yet bought that work. They did as I instructed them." Again, as we know, Erasmus downplays the size of his retranslation and also states that the missing lines were easily restored. There is some truth in that idea, since Revelation, as we know, is very repetitive. Still, Erasmus shows that he was aware of the problematic nature of his intervention. And he states that the problem of the first edition had been solved in the second. The text has been remedied by means of the Eldine edition, well, 1518. Erasmus is probably sincere here, but also seriously mistaken or misled. He never realized the nature of the Eldine New Testament text. It was derived from Erasmus's own first edition, with only some corrections, additional errors, and a few readings from other sources. For Revelation 22, as well as for most other cases, the Eldine edition has no independent value at all. We can only speculate as to what would have happened had Erasmus been present in Basel when the Eldine edition was consulted. In any case, he regarded the matter as closed, or at least he thought he had sufficiently countered Lee's criticisms. As he writes somewhat further on, I did not have a manuscript in the first edition. In the second edition, I had the help of the Aldine edition. Therefore, I fulfilled the promise I had made in the first edition. Well, there's a lot to do about the myths of Erasmian promises, but it should be noted that Erasmus did not make such an explicit promise in the first edition. For there, as we see, he only mentions that he had added some words, but in his mind, he interpreted this information in a twofold way. Readers who come across to the true Greek text or a better Greek text can supply it. But how would the reader know, actually? And he himself would remedy the problem at the first occasion, but the effort failed without him noticing it. In the longer apology of the same year, Erasmus first repeats Lee's idea that there still is a problem, but then when he discusses Lee's note against him more extensively, he writes the following. At the end, these words had been omitted by the carelessness of the scribes. And if anyone shall take away, well, this is Revelation 22, 18, 19. 19, verse 19. I realized what had caused the scribe to make a mistake. Since the words in this book are repeated, his eyes skipped to the second phrase, omitted what was in between. Indeed, no stumbling block more frequently trips up scribes. There was no doubt that the words had been omitted, and there were only a few. To avoid leaving a lacuna in my text, I supplied the Greek out of the Latin version. Here, Erasmus states that the missing text concerned Revelation 22:19, and that it was missing because of his scribal error. What is going on here? Well, Erasmus is spot on in his description of scribal error through homoioteliton as a phenomenon, but he is completely wrong in this specific case. His manuscript lacked Revelations 22:16b to 21, not just 22:19. However, there turns out to be a reason that Erasmus singled out this verse and, to put it positively, created a false recollection of the case. Because at the close of his own annotations, his critic Lee had tried to turn the warning of this verse against Erasmus. And he said, I wonder that you have not restrained yourself on the basis of what Revelation says. The obvious implication being that according to Lee, Erasmus tampering with the text should incur divine wrath. It is clear that he had taken Erasmus' reference to some words as implying just a few lines at most, and could not imagine that Revelation 22:19 was also part of the portion being retranslated. And he did not have the means to verify the Greek text. And he could only react to Erasmus' admission in his annotation, which he understood perfectly as referring to retranslation. In his reaction, and that is interesting, and that's why I think why he singled out this verse. In his reaction, Erasmus inverts the charge. If he had left out the verse, then he could have been accused of tampering, but he rather restored it, if only temporarily. Lee is surprised that I have not been deterred even by this present passage from daring what I've dared to do. Ridiculous. Why should this law of Revelation 22:19 deter me from adding anything or taking it away? To restore what is lacking is not adding. On the contrary, I would have diminished the text if I had not added what was clearly lacking. Here indeed we detect an important motive behind the retranslation. It was part of his responsibility as an editor. Let us pass to the internal evidence. In 1861, the minuscule manuscript used by Erasmus, or rather his assistant, resurfaced and was studied by Delitzsch and also by Tregelles. Well, there can be no doubt that this manuscript is indeed the one that was used, as numerous details show, and as the internal criticism, if you do it, also demonstrates beyond the shadow of a doubt. But there is some external evidence here as well. The manuscript cover mentions Reuchling's name, and it is located in the possession of Froben by a note from a former owner, showing that it was given away by Hieronymus Froben in 1553. It is a commentary manuscript of Revelation only, and it contains, interesting, on folio 5 recto, an incorrect attribution of the commentary to Hippolytus of Rome, which tallies with the remark made in passing by Erasmus somewhere else. And you see even that a 16th century hand has added here a nice remark in the margin here. Well, we know from Erasmus' own words that he applied retranslation at the end of the book. Retranslation also best explains an astonishingly large number of readings. There are several arguments here. Erasmus created readings that are otherwise completely unattested, at least in manuscript, that are not themselves derived from his own text. Since our Greek manuscript base today is so large, an occasional unattested reading could eventually be explained by assuming a lost or hitherto unknown Greek manuscript. But such an explanation cannot apply to the entire set found in Erasmus' text. Second, the Greek produced by Erasmus often bears typical translation traits, such as the choice of a different word, the omission of articles, and grammatical changes in verbal tenses. Well, I could give 100 examples, but I'll give only one and skip the rest. Here, Revelations 1:11, Erasmus adds from the late Vulgate Thais en Asia, taken from Revelations 1:4, and he omits an article, so it should be Thais en te Asia. So this omission of the article is very typical for Erasmus, as people who've studied the final verses know. This reading actually is attested in some manuscripts, but all those manuscripts are copies of printed editions. So there's no argument there. Except 2026, but I would urge the team in Wuppertal to study 2026 again, because there are really a number of readings that are only known from the Textus Receptus. So I think it was some scribal effort in the 16th century by someone who also looked at manuscript, but also looked at an Erasmian edition. And even there is a Beza reading that Beza introduced in 1582, found in 2026. So there is some work to do there. I'll skip some pages and I come to, because I have lots of information, but time is running out. Yes, this is a nice one. If you contrast what Erasmus did to Revelation with what he did with the rest of the New Testament, it shows, even just by way of conclusion actually, right? It's worthwhile to enumerate the points at which Erasmus' treatment of the Greek text of Revelation differs markedly from the rest of the New Testament. While Erasmus could send other manuscripts directly to the typesetters, after there is some editing still visible in those manuscripts, the Revelation manuscript was not suited as printer's copy. He had but one Greek manuscript for Revelation, a commentary manuscript of that, against at least 3 for each of the other 3 parts of the New Testament, so that cross-checking was largely impossible. He had little more than Vulgate at his disposal. While Erasmus' private view of the manuscript he had to use was not very high for the entire New Testament, at least he admitted that he had to correct them extensively before handing them to the typesetters. His interventions in the text of Revelation are far more frequent than elsewhere. For Revelation, he was far less prepared for any critical task on its text, as the paucity of annotations also shows. It can even be doubted whether he'd ever made a collation of a Greek manuscript of Revelation and its Vulgate text in the preparation in England, as he did for the other parts of the New Testament, the very origin of his annotations. And in Revelation, there is a pattern of pro-Vulgate corrections in the form of retranslations of the Vulgate into Greek, whereas in other parts of the New Testament, such interventions occur, but only very occasionally. And in the case of Revelation, Erasmus had to improvise far more than in the other parts of the New Testament. He did so contre cœur, not only because of his tremendous workload in those years, but also because of his low view of the book. And finally, only in the case of Revelation, he really had something to hide. Full exposure of what he had done to its Greek text would have invalidated the text critical foundation of his work and endangered his entire New Testament project. In just one aspect, Erasmus' treatment is nearly identical in all parts of the New Testament. In later editions, he never undertook a real revision of the Greek text. At this point, Revelation fared even somewhat better than other books, since in his 1527 edition, Erasmus took over a larger number of complutensian readings here than elsewhere. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will try to unmute everybody so that we can express our appreciation. So Jan, there's plenty of material you've given us, and in addition to that, the hints of another interesting reading, if not enough people ask questions, that we could ask you to go back and show us the slides which you presumably developed with much care but had to pass over. So I think the facility to ask questions is familiar to us all. I'm going to press the mute all button, and then I shall unmute Jan, and Martin has his hand up, but please, others are very welcome indeed to raise your hand now or during the course of questions to address them to Jan. Martin, speak.
Yes, others first, if there are others. Jan knows I have learned very much by Jan Krans. Yeah, thank you so much for your work on Erasmus. We are publishing this year a study on the manuscript 2814, the Codex Reuchlins. Yeah.
No.
Yes, and it was possible to identify the hand of Reuchlin. Günther Hägele, as the Codex is today, is in Augsburg, and there the librarian of Augsburg has identified the hand of Reuchlin. Hic citator Hippolytus is the hand of Reuchlin.
Okay.
Therefore, Erasmus knew that Hippolytus is quoted, but isn't the author of the commentary.
Okay.
And one other hint, yeah. Now, against the critic of Erasmus, one must say there was a strong competition to Complutensis, and the Complutensis manuscripts were very old too. Or one must say it was said that the Complutensis manuscripts are very old, but the Complutensis manuscript of Revelation was younger than 2814. The manuscript of which was used in Complutensis is lost. Erasmus could not control it. No. He was convinced that he had an older manuscript, yeah, and we must say today that textual form used by Complutensis, yeah, developed in the 11th century, and it is probable that the manuscript was a manuscript of the 13th or 14th century, and Erasmus' manuscript is late 12th century. It is not as old as Erasmus thought, but it is not younger than the Complutensian manuscript. And the maximum of manuscripts used in the Complutensis were 2 manuscripts. Mm-hmm. That is for understanding the problem of Erasmus. Yeah, should he correct his text of Revelation 22, hearing and seeing the Complutensian without controlling the manuscript? He didn't correct himself.
Well, thanks for the reference to Reuchlin. It's been very interesting because I looked in Reuchlin's work for any use of Revelation that he made and whether he used his manuscript. And this is a direct proof that's far more useful than anything written by Reuchlin, I think. As for the Complutensia, well, yes. Well, I still have to find a 16th century source that gives me directly proof that there was competition between Erasmus, between Froben and Madrid. I have not yet found a 16th century source that states that. That is something that starts popping up in the 18th and 19th century in scholarly literature, that there was some kind of race to have an editio princeps. And that also focuses very much on being the first to publish a Greek text. But if you look at Froben's edition, it is not, in the first place, a publication of the Greek text. The Greek text is some kind of underlying evidence there. So that it's a bit more complicated there. And of course, we always should ask, what did 16th century people know? And what kind of image did they want to project, and what did they know? So what could Erasmus know about the Complutensian text? Well, he probably remembered that his Revelation text had some problems, that he had done lots of strange things with it, but not the details. And so he decided to use the Complutensian polyglot because, in general, the Complutensian polyglot was very much in agreement with his text for the rest of the New Testament. So he naturally thought that the Complutensian polyglot would be better in Revelation, and so he could use it as some kind of inspiration for his work for the 4th edition. But he did not have any idea about age or whatever, or age of underlying manuscript or whatever. he once used the manuscript behind the Competentia Polyglot as some kind of argument against Codex Vaticanus. That's interesting. Huh? So if the Pope supported the Competentia project, it is very typical that he did not send what we now know as Codex Vaticanus, but he sent manuscripts that very much resemble the one that Erasmus used for his Greek New Testament. So that's a very early reference to Codex Vaticanus. But yeah, study goes on. Yes, thank you.
Super. Any more questions? Raise your hand or ask in chat. Oh, Jeff, yes, I see your hand. Unmute. Oh, sorry, I think I might have pressed that twice. Let me try again. Okay, Jeff.
Thank you, Hugh. I think I counted your unmute with another mute, so I'm sorry about that. And thank you for your paper, Jan. I'm very interested in the curse against adding and subtracting.
Yes.
And the way in which Erasmus responds to that. And I'm reminded that the same curse in a very explicit form occurs in the letter of Aristeas. And there's a very interesting response to it in Josephus. And it almost seems to be tongue-in-cheek when he says, you mustn't add and you mustn't subtract. So if you find anything that's been added, subtract it. And if you find anything that someone has subtracted, then add it again.
Yeah.
So that intense ambiguity, how you know whether there's something missing or something's been added, it's been reflected on since forever, and almost in a way that at least in Josephus makes a joke out of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very nice reference. Of course, for textual criticism, this verse is very complicated because I don't think it is about textual criticism as such, and it does not show awareness of scribal change and that the textual critic have the task to undo it. But in this case, for me, it was a very nice find for me that I finally found a reason why Erasmus created this false recollection of homotheleiton of just this verse. So that was really something that I had not expected to find. And Lee's accusations against him were, of course, very, very serious. And it may be one of the first times that really this verse in Revelation is used against some text critical work and then invoked again in text critical work. So it's very, very nice, actually. Yeah, I find that very interesting.
If I can ask a question myself, I was really interested by your observation that an intermediary was prepared for the printing of 2814. Is that specifically because it was a Catena manuscript, and so somebody needed to go through and take all the biblical text out of it, or was that a relatively common procedure?
Well, there's discussion on this one, actually. One moment, I have some notes on this. There's another note there. I should look into my footnotes there. This is really footnote stuff now, but okay, that's all right. No, I can't find it, but there is an article by Patrick Andries who says that maybe Erasmus started to have an intermediate copy for the typesetters with the epistles of Paul, but he stopped that process because it was too tedious and it was easier to just edit lightly the manuscript and send them to the typesetters and then do the rest of the corrections of forms. But in the case of Revelation, to have a commentary manuscript and then have the typesetter extract the text, well, it was problematic in the manuscript to begin with. And also the typesetters need to have quire estimates. They need to have a good estimate of the amount of text that is contained. And if you have a commentary manuscript in which you take only, well, 2 lines or 5 lines or 10 lines of each page, it becomes very complicated to have a good estimate of how the edition will be. And that's the main reason that when you have a commentary manuscript, you have to have this intermediate text. So you have to have what Patrick Andries calls la méthode indirecte in preparing the edition. But these two methods existed alongside each other. But it would have been, if you see the amount of interventions and the amount of changes that were made eventually to the text of 2814 in order to become the 1516 text, there are so many that it would be completely impractical for the typesetter first prepare the forms and then corrections to that form in the form of the interventions that we see on the page. So so the idea has occurred to someone that this Latin expression, de scribenda curavimus, so we had the text copied out, that the copying was actually the printing itself. But I think the logic of the case and the doability of the case really makes that impossible.
Thank you, that's interesting. Any bid for the last question? In that case, I shall unmute everyone to say thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jan and Martina, for two excellent papers on the